On the east side of Lake Tahoe, there's a piece of advice everyone repeats with the same seriousness, even those who never talk about these things. If you hear 3 knocks on the wood, don't answer. When I first arrived, I thought it was just a local superstition, some bit of folklore meant to spook newcomers. But one afternoon, I realized they meant it literally. I worked doing environmental surveys, and for a few months I rented a small cabin near the coast. That afternoon I had to finish some humidity measurements in a stream that empties into the lake. It was a simple task, so I stayed a little longer to complete a few notes before heading back. The forest was almost silent, just the dripping of leaves after a short drizzle. I was packing up my gear when I heard the first knock, a dry toke, like someone tapping a hollow log. I didn't think much of it. The second knock came a few seconds later, stronger, closer. That's when I remembered the locals' warning and felt my back tighten. I tried to focus on closing my pack, but the third knock echoed with a different force, like it came from a big trunk, one that vibrated from the inside. Birds took off all at once. The air grew so still, I could hear my heartbeat. I took a step toward the trail when footsteps began behind me. They weren't soft or quick. They were deliberate, heavy, certain. Like whatever was approaching had no doubt about where it was going. I turned with my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam barely caught 2 dark eyes between the trees, so close that I froze in place. The figure was enormous, but what unsettled me most wasn't its size. It was how it stood, upright, tense, almost motionless, staring at me without blinking. It stepped forward. The leaf litter crunched like someone had pressed their whole foot into it, not hooves or claws. Another step. I could feel its breath, short and deep, as if it had followed my trail all the way there. I backed up, but my boot got caught between some roots. While I tried to free myself, the creature raised an arm. It didn't do it to strike me full on. It was more like a gesture to push me out of its path. But the force of the contact was enough to knock me off balance and send me crashing sideways onto the ground. The impact knocked the air out of me. I got up as best I could and ran. This time, I didn't look back. The only thing I heard were its footsteps behind me. Not running, but making it perfectly clear that it was still there, marking each step like a warning. When I reached the populated area, a neighbor saw me pale and covered in mud. "Did you hear the 3 knocks?" he asked. I nodded without speaking. He said, "Then you already know. When it answers, it's best not to stay." And I understood why they never talk about it out loud.
Around midday, the wind had died down, and Lake Tahoe seemed to settle into calm. I was working as a temporary ranger, making rounds along the perimeter of an old abandoned pier that once served as a starting point for excursions. It was far from the main cabins, used only by the occasional fishermen or tourists looking for silence, so at that hour I didn't expect to find anyone. I had a thermos of coffee and my trail maintenance notebook with me. I walked along the damp wood of the pier, watching the water, dark, cold, move with barely a ripple. I crouched to check some loose nails on a section of the walkway, wrote a note in the notebook, and stood back up. The air was so still that the sound of my boots echoed sharply. I was about to head back to the truck when a distant murmur caught my attention. A low creak beneath the water, followed by a splash. I assumed it was a rock tossed by some curious animal, but it didn't quite sound like anything I'd ever heard in the lake. I pointed my flashlight toward the shore. The light hit something large, dark, half submerged beneath the surface. A big log, I guessed at first. But then the water in front of the pier erupted, as if something had burst upward with force. I felt a solid jolt that shook the wood under my feet. I stepped back, keeping the flashlight raised. A figure, tall, upright, far too disproportionate for a bear, rose from the water with the agility of something accustomed to moving carefully through thick undergrowth. It didn't growl or scream, nothing human either. It simply brushed the pier with a huge, knotted hand, and its face emerged, an indistinct shadow with dark eyes. A reflection in a puddle on the pier showed its full form: broad shoulders, long limbs, soaked dark hair. My instinct screamed, "Run!" but my legs refused. The creature stepped forward, the wood groaning beneath its weight. Then it lifted its arm and reached toward me with brutal speed. It grabbed my flashlight before I could react and yanked it away, flinging it into the lake. Everything went dark. I felt its breath, damp, foul, on my face, like a hot mass closing in. I managed to twist away and run toward the truck, stumbling over loose boards, fighting to stay upright. Its hand caught my jacket, fingers hooking into the fabric like wet claws. I pulled with all my strength, and at that moment came a dull crack. Something behind me splintered. Adrenaline gave me one last burst. I jumped into the back seat of the truck, turned the key, and tried to start the engine. It took a couple seconds longer than it should have. Long enough for me to hear a deep, violent crunch from the pier, as if the creature were tearing through it to get to me. I glanced in the rearview mirror for an instant. A massive shadow partially emerged, staggering, shaking off water and shattered wood. I hit the accelerator, doing everything I could not to look back. My heart hammered so hard it echoed inside the vehicle. I drove non-stop until I reached an area lit by old roadside lamps. I parked, gasping, and for a moment wondered if it had all been a hallucination. I haven't returned to the pier since, but every time I pass the lake at dusk, I imagine wet eyes watching me from the fog. And I know that version of silence is real.
I always avoided driving at night along the road that runs along the west side of Lake Tahoe. Not because of superstitions or tourist stories, it's simply a narrow stretch with tight curves and poor lighting. But that afternoon, I finished installing signage on a trail much later than planned, and I ended up heading back after the sky had already turned black. I had the equipment in the back of the truck and was thinking only about getting home, eating something quick, and going to bed. Around 9, halfway through the route, a small rock slide was blocking part of the road. It wasn't big, but enough to force me to stop and move a few stones by hand. I parked on the shoulder, turned on the hazard lights, and grabbed my gloves. The air was cold, and the lake below looked like a shapeless, dark mass. No cars passed by, not one. While moving the third stone, I heard a hollow thump coming from the forest on the opposite side of the road. I froze, waiting for it to repeat. Sometimes it's a deer, sometimes a bear, but what followed didn't match either. Branches breaking slowly as if something large were moving without hurry, without hiding. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it at the trees. The beam only revealed wet trunks and dense leaves, but the sound continued, moving diagonally toward me, unhurried, controlled, like a slow walk with purpose. It didn't sound like an animal fleeing or hunting, more like something approaching to see who was there. I felt a faint vibration in the road, subtle but there, like the ground transferring each step. I thought about getting back into the truck, but curiosity won. I stepped back a few meters and kept the flashlight fixed.
The silence became so deep I could hear my own breathing bouncing inside the scarf. Then I saw it. About 10 meters inside the forest, a massive figure crossed between two pines. It wasn't fully illuminated, just an outline, but the shape was unmistakable. Upright, broad-shouldered, with a head that seemed to shift slightly, searching for a better angle to look at me. It wasn't a bear. It didn't move like one, and it didn't match the silhouette of any animal in the area. The figure took another step, and I heard its breathing, heavy, deep, so pronounced that it sounded like its chest was expanding like a bellows. I froze. A thought hit me. If I ran, it might trigger a reaction. If I did nothing, it might too. I had no idea how something like that would respond. The figure moved left, keeping to the trees, as if it wanted to see the truck, to check if I was alone. Its movement wasn't clumsy or wild, it was deliberate. I backed toward the vehicle without looking away. I opened the door slowly, trying not to make noise. When I turned on the engine, the figure stopped completely. It didn't flee, didn't attack. It just stood there, breathing, as if taking note. I drove without stopping until I reached a lit area. Since then, every time I drive through that stretch, I don't look toward the forest. He knows how to look toward the road.
It had been drizzling all afternoon at Lake Tahoe. A rain so fine it barely left marks, but enough to soak the air with the smell of wet wood. My shift cleaning the cabins on the south side had ended, and I was ready to leave when the supervisor asked me to check the boats at the dock. The wind tended to pick up suddenly at night, and they didn't want to find a loose boat floating around in the morning. It wasn't a hard job, so I agreed. The area was completely empty. The last tourists had left as soon as the sky darkened and the fog started crawling in from the water. I walked along the walkway, checking each knot one by one, feeling the damp wood creak under my boots. The lake was still, too still. In Tahoe, when there's no one around, the silence becomes strange, like something is waiting between the trees. I finished the inspection and leaned on the railing, watching the fog drift slowly across the dark mirror of the water. I was about to head back to the truck when I heard a muffled thud coming from the edge of the forest. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't a deer. It sounded like the impact of something heavy landing solidly. I froze, waiting for a second sound that would confirm it was just a regular animal. What came next was worse. A deep, long breath, heavy with fatigue or effort, a kind of breathing I had never heard in that area. I took 2 steps toward the start of the dock, lifting my flashlight, but the white beam vanished into the shadows. Nothing moved between the trees. Then the footsteps began. Slow, measured, heavy. Not dragged like those of a bear's, nor quick like a deer's. They were firm steps, as if whatever it was were choosing exactly where to place its feet. The sound was coming straight into the light's edge. A damp, earthy smell drifted in with the breeze. It wasn't the usual wet forest scent. It was denser, as if something large and covered in soaked fur was close to me. I remembered some vague reports from tourists during the summer, but we had never taken them seriously. A silhouette emerged between the trees. It wasn't fully lit. I could only make out the upper part of the torso, broad, dark, and far too upright for any local animal. The figure stopped, evaluating me in silence. It didn't growl or make any aggressive noise. It just breathed, slow and heavy, as if its presence alone was enough of a warning. I stepped back without turning my back on it. Every step I took seemed to tense the figure, as if it were measuring my distance. When I reached the truck,
A plank on the dock creaked under my weight. In that exact instant, the silhouette slipped behind a tree with a quick, precise movement, almost calculated. I didn't stay to see if it came out again. I started the engine and didn't check the mirrors until I reached the highway.